The lake didn't make a sound when it started rising. No sirens, no shouting, just water climbing fences, swallowing decks, and creeping into 86 luxury homes like it belonged there. I didn't run, I didn't call anyone, I just watched. Because when someone builds on land, they don't understand nature has its own way of settling the score. They tried to erase my shoreline. They even called the cops to push me out. But this place remembers who it belongs to, and sometimes it pushes back. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. This one's gonna sting. One morning, I woke up to the roar of bulldozers. I'm not even kidding. It sounded like a freight train had parked in my backyard. I stumbled outside in my pajamas, still half asleep, and couldn't believe what I was seeing. Veronica Wilson, power suit heels, clipboard, and that smug smile like she'd just annexed my shoreline. She had secretly bought the land right next to the lake and started building 86 luxury homes without any notice to anyone. When she saw me staring, she actually had the nerve to wave and shout over the machinery noise. "This is our land. We can do whatever we want with it." I'm not sure what shocked me more, the fact that she'd started construction at 6 in the morning, or that she seemed genuinely pleased to see my horrified expression. Looking back, I should have known this was her way of declaring war. Dust clouds rose like mini twisters. Machines groaned. Even the lake turned brown, choking with floating fish. I felt like part of my soul was being ripped away watching this peaceful place that had been my family's sanctuary for decades get torn apart by these massive machines. The noise was so overwhelming I could barely think straight. My neighbor's dog was howling nonstop, and I could see other residents peeking out their windows with the same horrified expressions I probably had on my face. I wasn't sure if I was overreacting at first. Maybe this was just normal construction noise that I'd get used to. But something in my gut told me this was just the beginning of something much worse. At the time, I was still trying to process what was happening, still hoping maybe there was some reasonable explanation for all this madness. I even tried neighborly peace, homemade cookies. She didn't flinch, just called the lake hers. I walked over to the construction site, dodging workers and machinery, trying to look friendly and neighborly, despite the chaos swirling around me. When I finally reached Veronica, she was barking orders at some poor contractor who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else on earth. The guy kept nodding and saying, "Yes, ma'am," while she pointed aggressively at different parts of the construction site. I cleared my throat and held out the plate of cookies, putting on my best diplomatic smile and saying something like, "Hey, Veronica, I brought some cookies from Fred next door. Maybe we could talk about what's happening here." She barely glanced at the plate, and I swear her eyes got this cold, calculating look that made my skin crawl. It was like watching a switch flip from fake pleasantness to pure business mode. She smirked at me like I was some kind of naive child who didn't understand how the real world worked, and said in this condescending tone, "Reed, you should know better. This lake will be ours sooner or later anyway." The way she said it, so casual, so confident, it was like she already knew something I didn't. Maybe she'd been planning this takeover for months, or maybe she had inside information about property laws that I wasn't aware of. I stood there holding those cookies feeling like a complete idiot, while she turned back to her workers and completely dismissed me like I was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. That's when I realized this wasn't going to be settled with neighborly conversation and baked goods. This woman had a plan, and apparently I was standing directly in her way. Back home, I was feeling pretty defeated, but also angry in a way I hadn't felt in years. The kind of anger that starts in your chest and spreads through your whole body until your hands are shaking. I started searching through old documents looking for anything that might help me fight back legally. My dad had always been meticulous about keeping records. Tax documents, property deeds, construction permits, even old correspondence with city officials. I knew there had to be something useful buried in all those boxes in the basement. I was digging through dusty files and old blueprints, sneezing from the dust, and getting increasingly frustrated when I found something that made me stop dead in my tracks. In an old metal box underneath a bunch of property deeds and insurance papers, I found my dad's original blueprints for the lake. But there was something written on them, in his careful handwriting, that I'd never seen before. Emergency flood valve. Use only when lake is threatened. Opens underground springs. I stared at the diagram for what felt like forever, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There was this incredibly detailed drawing of a valve system at the bottom of the lake, connected to what looked like underground water channels and natural springs. My dad had built this lake back in the 1970s, but I never knew about any kind of emergency flood control system. I mean, why would he need something like that? I remembered him always saying that this lake was the heart of the area, and if anyone ever tried to harm it, there were ways to protect it. At the time, I thought he was just being poetic, like when older people talk about the good old days and how things used to be better. But looking at these blueprints, studying every line and notation, I realized he'd been completely literal. There was actually a sophisticated flood control system down there that nobody else knew about. Not the HOA, not the city planners, probably not even the original construction crews who helped him build it. I held those blueprints in my hands, feeling some strange kind of power coursing through me. She had blueprints not just for homes, but for erasing me from the shoreline. And I was about to find something that said, "My dad saw this coming." Within a week, no trespassing signs went up everywhere around the construction site. I'm talking about signs every 10 feet like they were marking some kind of military zone or federal prison. Then the threatening letters started arriving daily, official-looking documents from the HOA legal team, each one more intimidating than the last. The envelopes were thick and expensive-looking, with law firm letterheads that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. The arguments started happening every evening when the workers went home, and Veronica would patrol the area like she owned the whole neighborhood, which apparently she thought she did. The HOA had started what I can only describe as psychological warfare against me, and I wasn't sure if I was overreacting at first. But when your neighbors start treating you like a criminal for living in your own home, you know something's seriously wrong with the picture. They built these sky-high barriers that completely cut off my familiar path to the lake, the same path I'd been walking since I was a kid. I'm talking about 8-foot wooden fences that looked more like prison walls than neighborhood boundaries. They built a wall of junk concrete slabs, twisted rebar enough to turn fresh air into a landfill. The smell was so bad I couldn't even open my windows on the lakeside of the house without gagging. But the worst part, the thing that really got under my skin, was how they started filming me 24/7 looking for any minor violation they could use against me. I'd go out to get my mail, and there'd be someone with a camera documenting my every move, like I was some kind of dangerous criminal, plotting the neighborhood's destruction. Maybe I should have just ignored them, but honestly, who wouldn't feel paranoid with that kind of surveillance? They fined me $8,000 for koi. Apparently ornamental fish were now neighborhood threats. I stared at that letter for a full minute before I could even process what I was reading. $8,000 for fish. They were claiming that the fish in my backyard pond, the little decorative koi pond my dad had built with his own hands, were somehow a violation of community standards. I actually laughed out loud when I read it, which probably wasn't the reaction they were hoping for. I mean, seriously, they thought I was raising sharks in my backyard pond or something. Were they expecting me to get permits for goldfish? The whole thing was so ridiculous, I didn't know whether to cry, laugh, or start planning my revenge right then and there. Looking back, I think that fine was when I realized these people weren't playing by any normal rules. That evening, something weird happened that made me think maybe I wasn't as alone in this fight as I felt. I found an anonymous letter slipped under my door. No postmark, no return address, no signature, just a simple message written in careful block letters. "This project is illegal. Check blueprint approval number 12. You're not alone. A friend?" Taped to the back was a torn page from the HOA charter, highlighted section 12.4. All constructions must comply with federal water overlays. That changed everything. I read it 3 times trying to figure out who might have sent it. The handwriting didn't look familiar, and the paper was just generic office stock that could have come from anywhere. Someone inside the HOA was secretly trying to help me, but who and why stay hidden? It made me paranoid, wondering if this was another trap designed to make me feel confident before they pulled the rug out from under me. I decided I'd had enough of playing defense and letting them control the narrative. I started documenting all the harassment, taking photos with timestamps, recording videos of their illegal dumping, keeping detailed logs of every interaction and violation I witnessed. If they wanted to play dirty, I was going to make sure I had evidence of everything they were doing wrong. I felt like some kind of private investigator sneaking around my own property to document their illegal activities and building a case against them. The irony wasn't lost on me. They were calling me the troublemaker while they were the ones breaking every environmental and zoning rule in the book. I spent hours organizing files and creating a timeline of events, building a comprehensive case that would hopefully expose what they were really up to. Maybe I was being too methodical, but my dad always taught me that preparation and documentation win more battles than anger and impulse. At the next community meeting, I decided to go on the offensive instead of sitting back and letting them steamroll over me. I walked into that stuffy conference room with my folder full of evidence and dropped it right on the table in front of everyone with a satisfying thud. The room went quiet, and I could feel every pair of eyes in the place focused on me. I told them the project lacked proper environmental permits and showed clear signs of under-the-table deals with local government officials. I had photographs, documents, even recordings of conversations where workers admitted they were cutting corners to save money. Veronica's face went completely pale, and for the first time since this whole mess started, she looked genuinely worried instead of smug and confident. She ordered security to remove me, her voice getting shrill as she shouted, "Reed, you have no right to be here!" But I stood my ground probably louder than I should have and said, "I'm a citizen and I have the right to speak the truth. This project is destroying the environment." The room went dead silent after that, and I could feel everyone staring at me, trying to figure out if I was a neighborhood hero fighting corruption or just a lunatic who had finally snapped. As I looked around that meeting room, studying each face for any sign of sympathy or support, I couldn't help wondering which one of them was secretly helping me. Was this entire HOA war just the surface and I'd just been invited to see what lay beneath it? After that community meeting, things escalated faster than I ever imagined they could. Veronica decided to use what she called her ultimate weapon. She had the HOA cut off my electricity and water under the ridiculous excuse of repairing the community-wide system. Of course, every other house in the neighborhood still had power and water running just fine. No lights, no heat, just me boiling snow and swearing in the dark. The hand pump was rusty and took forever to get enough water for basic needs, and I actually found myself laughing while I worked at thinking about how absolutely ridiculous the whole situation had become. They think these childish tricks will make me give up Dream On, I muttered to myself, though I'll admit the novelty wore off pretty quickly when I had to take ice-cold showers for a week straight and eat nothing but canned food that didn't require cooking. Meanwhile, she poisoned conversations. Neighbors I'd once fixed fences for now locked eyes with their lawns. The worst part was watching some of my neighbors, people I'd known for years, people I'd helped during emergencies and shared holiday cookies with, actually start to believe her lies. They were suddenly looking at me with suspicious eyes, like I'd transformed overnight from friendly neighbor into some kind of dangerous radical who hated progress. I wasn't sure if I was being paranoid, but it felt like the whole community was gradually turning against me. Maybe I should have just walked away at that point, packed up my memories, and moved somewhere else where I could start fresh. I don't know, but something deep inside me refused to give up on the home my father had built with his own hands. Nights got quieter, thoughts got louder. Even my shadow looked like it doubted me. The isolation was getting to me in ways I hadn't expected. When you're cut off from basic utilities and most of your neighbors think you're crazy, you start questioning everything about yourself. But then I'd remember my father's blueprint, that secret valve sitting at the bottom of the lake, like some kind of hidden ace card, and a crazy idea would flash through my mind. If there was truly no other way to stop this madness, maybe it was time to consider using the nuclear option. I'd stare at the ceiling in the darkness, imagining what would happen if I actually opened that valve, and the thought both terrified and thrilled me at the same time. Then something happened that completely changed everything, and made me realize this fight wasn't as hopeless as I'd thought. At an internal HO, a meeting, which I wasn't supposed to know about, but apparently my mysterious friend was still feeding me information through anonymous notes. Harold Peterson, the same stern-looking man who had signed my $8,000 fine just a week earlier, suddenly turned around and confronted Veronica in front of the entire board. Harold was this serious guy in his 50s who had always seemed like Veronica's most loyal lieutenant, the kind of person who never questioned authority and always followed the rules. But apparently his son was a construction engineer working for a reputable firm in the city, and when Harold showed him the building plans for the Lakefront development, his son had taken one look and told him, "Dad, only someone with a death wish would dare build this close to a lake without proper flood controls and drainage systems." So, there was Harold demanding in front of the entire board that Veronica clearly explain the construction safety measures they were using to prevent flooding and environmental damage. I wish I could have been a fly on the wall for that meeting, because according to my anonymous source, Veronica started sweating bullets and tried to dodge every single question Harold threw at her. Other board members started asking their own questions, and the whole meeting turned into this tense interrogation where Veronica couldn't give straight answers about basic safety protocols. The woman who had been so confident and controlling, who always had a snappy comeback for everything, suddenly couldn't explain why they were building so close to the water without proper safeguards. Harold didn't just flip. He handed me something, an old survey map marked in red, original floodplain, unfit for high-density housing. I couldn't believe it when I heard about Harold's complete turnaround. Later that evening, I was sitting in my dark kitchen, eating a cold sandwich by candlelight, feeling like some kind of medieval peasant, when I saw Harold walking slowly past my house. He wasn't just passing by randomly. He deliberately slowed down when he got to my driveway, looked directly at my kitchen window, and gave me this slight but unmistakable nod. It wasn't much, just a simple acknowledgement, but it was the first sign of support I'd gotten from anyone on the HOA board since this whole nightmare started. I nodded back, not sure if this was the beginning of a real alliance or if I was being set up for an even bigger fall than before. The whole situation was making me question everything I thought I knew about my neighbors and the community I'd lived in for decades. Harold nodded once and disappeared. But as the moon hit the lake's surface, I realized someone else had found my father's valve plans, and they weren't on my side. My complaints to the local government had started getting some serious attention from environmental groups and investigative reporters, and that was making Veronica desperate in ways I hadn't expected. She was losing control of the narrative that she'd worked so hard to build, and desperate people with power tend to do really desperate things. That's when she decided to play what she thought was her ace in the hole. She called the cops to evict me from the house I was born in. Her voice, soft-polished, weaponized. I'm still not sure how she managed to convince them that my family's property, which we'd owned and paid taxes on for 40 years, was somehow HOA common area that I was illegally occupying. But there I was, standing in my own driveway like some kind of bewildered criminal, watching 2 patrol cars pull up with their lights flashing like I was dangerous enough to require backup officers. "Officer, this man is illegally occupying HOA common area. We need him removed immediately." Veronica told the arriving police with this fake concerned citizen voice, waving around what looked like official documents, but were probably fake as a $3 bill. She'd even dressed up for the occasion. Business suit, briefcase, the whole professional act designed to make her look legitimate, and me look like a squatter. I was so shocked by the sheer audacity of it that I could barely speak coherently. "This is my house. My family has lived here for decades," I kept saying. But the officers looked genuinely confused by the conflicting claims we were making. They were trying to be professional about the whole mess, asking questions and examining documents, but I could tell they weren't sure what to believe when faced with 2 completely different versions of reality. One of them finally told me I might need to temporarily relocate while they sorted out the property dispute through proper legal channels. Earlier that same day, I'd had the misfortune of watching Veronica on the local news, smiling brightly for the cameras and announcing with fake enthusiasm, "Lakeview Elite will be the pride of our city. We're bringing modern luxury and increased property values to an area that's been neglected for too long." She had these cold, calculating eyes that made my skin crawl, but she definitely knew how to put on a show for the media and local politicians. Watching her on television acting like some kind of community hero and visionary developer while she was actively trying to destroy everything my family had built made me feel physically sick to my stomach. The hypocrisy was so thick, you could cut it with a knife and serve it for dinner. Here she was presenting herself as this pillar of the community who only wanted what was best for everyone, while behind the scenes she was using dirty tactics to steal people's homes and destroy the environment for profit. After the police left with their promise to investigate the property dispute, I traced the valve sketch with my thumbnail like I was loading a weapon my father left me. That visit from the cops had changed everything for me, had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. They actually tried to kick me out of my own home, the house my dad had designed and built with his own hands back when this was still a quiet, peaceful area. My voice was deadly calm when I said out loud to the empty room, "They want to evict me from the house Dad built. Let's see how they handle a flood." I wasn't angry anymore in that explosive, emotional way. I was cold, focused, determined. This had gone way beyond a simple neighborhood dispute or property development disagreement. This was war, and they'd just declared it by trying to make me homeless. Old Fred came by that evening bringing an oil lamp and some homemade soup. He'd been watching everything unfold from his front porch, and I think he could see that I'd reached my breaking point and was about to do something drastic. "Reed, are you sure you want to do this?" he asked quietly, though he didn't spell out exactly what this was. But somehow he knew what I was thinking. "Once you open that flood valve, there's no going back," he said with this sad, knowing expression. I looked at him in the flickering lamplight, and I realized he'd probably known about the emergency flood control system for years. He and my dad had been close friends for 30 years. Of course he knew about the valve and what it could do. "Your father would be proud of you, son." That's when I knew I'd made my final decision. While I was sitting there, contemplating what felt like the biggest and most dangerous decision of my entire life, someone knocked softly on my door. I opened it to find this nervous middle-aged guy I'd never seen before, constantly checking over his shoulder, like he was afraid of being followed. "I'm Mike Thompson, former HOA technical staff," he said in this quiet, urgent voice. Mike wasn't just staff. He'd signed off on their flood analysis and kept a backup report, one they altered before filing to the county. Turns out Mike had been forced to quit his job because he refused to ignore safety regulations and environmental protections just to save money on the project. He had a whole manila envelope full of evidence, photographs showing substandard materials, technical reports proving that the foundations of those 86 houses were dangerously weak, and internal memos discussing how to hide building code violations from inspectors. He handed me everything he had, but he was too scared to go public himself, because Veronica had threatened him with massive lawsuits if he talked to anyone about what he'd seen. I spent the rest of that night preparing for what I knew would be the point of no return. I drove to the sporting goods store and bought a simple diving suit, waterproof flashlight, and the heavy-duty tools I'd need to operate that underwater valve system. I kept telling myself I didn't want to harm anyone. I just wanted to expose the truth, protect what my father had built, and show these corrupt people that there are consequences for greed and lies. "Dad, I hope you won't be disappointed in me," I whispered, while looking at the blueprint one last time, memorizing every detail of the valve location and operation. "I'll use what you taught me to protect this lake and everything it represents." At the time, I thought I was defending my home. I didn't realize I was about to trigger the exact chain reaction my father warned me never to touch. On a stormy Thursday night, with rain pounding against my windows like angry fists and wind howling through the trees like something out of a horror movie, I made my final decision. The police visit earlier that week had been the ultimate insult. They had actually tried to evict me from the house my father built, based on fake documents and Veronica's carefully constructed lies. I wasn't going to let them destroy everything my family had worked for over the past 40 years. I put on the diving suit I'd bought, checked my waterproof flashlight 3 times to make sure it would work underwater, and gathered all the valve opening tools I'd need for what felt like the most important mission of my life. My hands were shaking as I prepared for what I knew would change everything forever. Standing at the edge of the lake in the pouring rain, with lightning flashing in the distance, I took one last look at those 86 houses rising up like monuments to greed and corruption. I dove blind, silt in my teeth, the valve buried like a rusted god. I had to rely entirely on my memory of the blueprint and the weak beam of my flashlight cutting through the murky water. Swimming down toward the bottom, fighting against the current, and my own fear, I could feel the pressure building in my ears until it was almost unbearable. My heart was pounding so hard I was worried it might give out before I found the valve. And I kept having these moments of panic where I wondered if I was making a terrible mistake. Then finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, my light swept across something metallic and rust-covered. There it was, exactly where my father's diagram said it would be. The valve was absolutely massive, probably 3 feet across and covered in decades of algae rust and underwater growth. Opening that valve was like trying to turn the steering wheel of a car that's been sitting in a junkyard for decades. The thing was completely rusted shut, and I had to use every ounce of strength I had just to get it to budge even slightly. I was running out of air, my lungs burning, and my vision starting to get fuzzy around the edges, but I kept working at it with the tools I'd brought down. My gloves slipped. I almost surfaced, but I didn't. I turned that valve until my shoulder popped. Then suddenly, crack! There was this loud groaning sound that echoed through the water, like some ancient machine finally coming to life. The valve finally gave way, and I spun it as far as I could, feeling decades of rust and debris breaking free. Immediately, I felt the lake beginning to change around me in ways that were both terrifying and amazing. Water started rushing in from underground springs with tremendous force, and I could feel the lake swelling and expanding like it was taking a deep breath. They froze at the waterline, a backhoe half swallowed, buckets spinning like drowned toys. I watched from the kitchen mug, steady heart louder than the storm. At first they thought it was just from the heavy rain we'd been having, or maybe some kind of natural flooding caused by the storm. Workers were standing around scratching their heads, talking to each other in confused voices, trying to figure out where all this water had come from so suddenly. By noon, disaster was revealing itself in all its terrifying glory. Drainage buried. The water didn't care. It lunged past the retaining berm, climbed steps it had no business reaching. Screams started when basement lights fizzled out. The ones that had their foundations completed were flooding from the ground up. Water rushing through the basement levels, rising up the walls, and starting to reach the first floors where electrical systems and expensive materials were stored. I could hear screaming and shouting from the construction site as workers scrambled to higher ground, abandoning their equipment and running for safety. A cement truck spun sideways, sank in slow motion. A roof panel lifted like a sail. It was total chaos, and I'll admit, part of me was enjoying every single minute of watching Veronica's dream project turn into an underwater graveyard. One worker screamed something about a secondary valve. My blood froze. What secondary valve? That's when Veronica appeared at the site, and I've never seen anyone look so completely terrified in my entire life. Her face was completely pale, drained of all color. Her eyes were bulging out of her head, like she was seeing something impossible. And she was screaming at anyone who would listen. What the hell is happening? Where's all this water coming from? This can't be natural. So she was running around in her expensive heels, trying to direct the chaos and salvage what was left of her development, but there was absolutely nothing anyone could do to stop the relentless flood. The water just kept coming, wave after wave, flooding through the construction site and turning her precious luxury development into an underwater nightmare. When the police and emergency responders arrived, she was practically hysterical, demanding they arrest anyone for what was happening to her investment. Old Fred showed up at the scene playing his part absolutely perfectly. I noticed the lake rising since early morning, he told the officers with a completely straight face and genuine concern in his voice. He was trying to mislead them to protect me, and I was deeply touched by his loyalty, but I didn't want Fred to get in trouble for my actions. So when the police started asking questions and looking for someone to blame, I stepped forward and said with as much innocence as I could muster, I was here last night checking on things because I was worried about flooding with all that rain we've been getting. But these underground water systems are completely unpredictable. Natural springs can surge any time without warning. Then Harold showed up, took one look at the flooding construction site with his engineering-trained eye, and immediately understood what was really happening here. This isn't Reed's fault, he announced loudly to the confused police officers and emergency responders. This is exactly what happens when you build in a flood zone without proper water management systems and drainage infrastructure. I warned about this risk from the very beginning of this project. His words hit Veronica like a physical slap in the face. Here was her own board member publicly stating that the flooding was caused by her poor planning and corner cutting, not by any kind of sabotage or criminal activity. Standing there in the midst of all that chaos, watching those 86 luxury houses slowly flooding, while Veronica screamed and pointed fingers at anyone she could think of, I felt this strange mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Watching those 86 homes drown wasn't victory, it was anatomy. Drywall swelling like lungs, windows bursting like blood vessels. This was biology. This was revenge. But as I stood watching their homes drown, one thought hit harder than the storm. What if I hadn't opened the only valve? The news blared from the old radio I'd rewired into the wall because HOA still hadn't turned my power back on. I didn't need a screen to know what the aerial shots looked like. I'd seen them in real time. Within 24 hours, it had made regional and even national headlines. 86 luxury homes flooded at Lakeview Elite Development was plastered across every local newspaper news website and television broadcast in the tri-state area. I sat at my kitchen table feeling this weird mixture of vindication and disbelief that my plan had actually worked so completely. The aerial photos were absolutely incredible, Rows of half-built houses standing in several feet of water, looking like some kind of apocalyptic movie set or post-disaster wasteland. Construction equipment was scattered around like children's toys, and you could see the foundation damage and structural problems even from the helicopter shots the news crews were taking. The financial damage was being estimated in the millions of dollars. The insurers didn't flinch. Natural causes, they said. Their silence screamed your greed isn't covered. By day 2, the investors started panicking and rushing to the HOA offices in angry mobs demanding their money back and threatening lawsuits. From my truck, I watched investors in loafers and $300 scarves bang on HOA glass like trapped birds. One held blueprints soaked with lake water. Another lit a cigar with a contract. Veronica's phone was apparently ringing non-stop from dawn to midnight, but she could only offer increasingly desperate excuses and denials. Word was getting around that she'd been dodging calls, hiding in her office with the blinds drawn, and refusing to meet with the people who had trusted her with their life savings and retirement funds. The woman who had been so confident and controlling just a week earlier, who always had a snappy comeback and seemed to have everything under control, was now completely overwhelmed by the disaster she'd created through her own arrogance and cost-cutting measures. By day 3, the local government had opened a comprehensive investigation into the whole project, bringing in experts from the State Environmental Agency and Federal Flood Management Office. All those files that Harold and Mike had provided were finally getting the serious attention they deserved from people with real authority and investigative power. Inspectors in state jackets stepped over floating floorboards, photographing foundation rot with forensic detachment. One found a pipe labeled "Temp Do Not Use" hooked into every unit. Environmental inspectors, building code officials, water management experts, and even FBI agents specializing in construction fraud were crawling all over the site, documenting every violation they could find with cameras and measuring equipment. The construction companies that had been working on the project started pointing fingers at each other, trying to avoid liability and criminal charges. Not our fault. Those were HO. Requirements and specifications became the standard response whenever reporters asked about the substandard foundations and complete lack of proper drainage systems. The investigation results were even worse than I'd expected, reading like a textbook example of everything that can go wrong when greed overrides common sense. The official report listed violation after violation, ignoring established flood zone regulations, building without proper water management systems, lacking complete environmental permits, bribing local officials to bypass flood safety inspections, and illegally building in environmentally sensitive wetland areas that should have been protected by federal law. Reading through that report was like watching a masterclass in corruption, incompetence, and environmental destruction. Every corner they could cut, they had cut. Every regulation they could ignore or circumvent they had ignored, every safety measure they could skip to save money they had skipped. It was honestly amazing that the whole thing hadn't collapsed even sooner than it did, and I started to realize that my father's flood valve might have just accelerated something that was going to happen anyway. Veronica's downfall was swift, complete, and absolutely devastating to watch. She was hit with massive fines from multiple government agencies, environmental protection, building code enforcement, fraud investigation units, and had to sell all her personal assets just to try to compensate the investors who were threatening to sue her into complete bankruptcy. Her expensive house went up for sale, her luxury cars were repossessed, and she had to liquidate her investment portfolio just to pay legal fees. The HOA Lakeview Elite was officially dissolved by court order, and all the land plots were confiscated by the county and put up for public auction. I wanted to cheer, but I didn't. Watching Veronica load cardboard boxes into a rental van felt less like revenge and more like history, rolling over someone too arrogant to read maps. She'd brought this complete destruction on herself through pure greed, arrogance, and willingness to destroy anything that stood in her way, and now she was facing the consequences of treating people like obstacles to be bulldozed. The community response was probably the most satisfying part of the whole mess, even more than watching Veronica's empire crumble. Neighbors who had been suspicious of me during the height of the conflict started coming by to apologize and offer support, bringing casseroles and genuine expressions of remorse for doubting me. Old Fred became something of a local hero when he told reporters about how I'd tried to warn everyone from the beginning, how I'd fought a lonely battle to protect the lake that was the heart of our community. Reed never wanted to hurt anyone, Fred told the cameras with that sincere grandfatherly way he had of speaking. He just wanted to protect the lake his father created for all of us to enjoy. He was trying to preserve something beautiful in a world that seems determined to destroy everything natural. It felt incredible to finally have people understanding my side of the story, even if it had taken a complete disaster to make them listen and see the truth. As for me, I didn't feel the complete satisfaction I'd expected when I first planned this whole thing. Don't get me wrong, seeing justice served felt good, and knowing that Veronica could never again threaten my home or destroy my lake gave me genuine peace of mind. But watching people lose their investments, seeing construction workers lose their jobs, witnessing all that waste and environmental destruction, it wasn't something to celebrate or feel proud of. I just wanted everything to return to its proper place, to restore the natural balance that had been disrupted by greed and corruption. I started making concrete plans to use whatever compensation money came from the inevitable lawsuits to restore the lake and surrounding area to its original beauty and ecological health. But even with the HOA gone and the water settling, one piece of my father's plan was still unspoken, and only I knew where it slept. With the substantial compensation money from the multiple lawsuits that followed the investigation, I decided to turn this whole environmental disaster into something genuinely positive for the community. I hired a professional cleanup crew with experience in environmental restoration to remove all the debris left behind by the failed development, twisted metal, broken concrete construction waste that had been scattered around the lake by the flooding and abandoned by the bankrupt construction companies. It took several weeks of careful work to clear everything out without damaging the lake's ecosystem, but slowly and surely the area started looking like itself again. I organized what I called a lake rebirth ceremony, inviting all the neighbors who had supported me through this ordeal, and of course old Fred, who had been my rock throughout this whole nightmare. We planted native trees together, carefully cleaned up the shoreline using environmentally safe methods, and released new fish into the water to replace the ones that had died during the construction chaos and subsequent flooding. One kid, maybe 7 or 8, stood beside the dock with a paper sign that said, "Thank you for saving the lake." Her mom said she'd insisted on making it that morning. I almost couldn't speak when she asked me, "Did your dad build the water?" I knelt beside her and said, "Not exactly, but he gave it a heart." She didn't say anything back, just nodded like she understood more than I ever did at that age. Nature didn't just rebound, it retaliated with wildflowers. Birds I hadn't seen since childhood stitched the air above the dock. Within just a few weeks, fresh air had returned to the area, and that peaceful feeling I'd lost for so many months was gradually coming back like a weight being lifted from my shoulders. I'd wake up in the morning, make my coffee, and sit on my porch listening to the sounds of nature instead of bulldozers, dump trucks, and power tools. The lake didn't just recover, it remembered. Every ripple knew the shape of his hands. The waterline curved back like it had muscle memory. Neighbors started walking their dogs along the shoreline. Again, kids were fishing from the old dock that had been blocked off during construction, and everything felt right with the world for the first time in over a year. The stress lines on people's faces were disappearing, and there was laughter in the air again instead of constant tension and worry. But then something strange and wonderful started happening that made people think they were witnessing some kind of environmental miracle. The floodwaters that had risen so dramatically during the storm were gradually receding back to normal levels in a way that defied all the experts' predictions about flood recovery times. Day by day, the lake was returning to its original boundaries, as if nature itself was actively correcting the disruption that had been caused by all the human interference and environmental damage. The water was crystal clear again, that beautiful deep blue color that reflected the sky like a perfect mirror. Migrating birds that had been scared away by months of construction noise started coming back in larger numbers than anyone had seen in years, and you could see fish jumping at sunset just like in the old days when I was a kid helping my father stock the lake. "Did you see that heron?" someone whispered, like they were in church. Another neighbor just stared at the water, tears quietly tracking his jawline. Old Fred was absolutely amazed by what seemed like nature's perfect timing and self-correction. "Reed, the water is going back to normal," he said one afternoon, shaking his head in genuine wonder. "This is absolutely unbelievable. How did nature fix itself like that so quickly and completely?" Other neighbors rushed over to see what he was talking about, and soon there were people gathered around the lake every evening, watching this gradual return to normalcy, like it was some kind of religious or spiritual experience. The story of the self-controlling flood started spreading beyond our little community, and we had reporters coming by to document what they were calling a natural phenomenon and an environmental recovery miracle. Scientists from the university were taking water samples and studying the geological formations, trying to understand how the lake could regulate itself so efficiently. What none of them knew, what I hadn't told anyone, not even faithful old Fred, was that I became the lake's quiet engineer, its hidden pulse. Where others saw a miracle, I saw calibrated pressure differentials. On quiet afternoons when everyone had gone home and I was alone by the lake, I would quietly slip on my diving gear and make my way down to that valve at the bottom, like I was visiting an old friend. But this time, instead of opening it wider to increase the flood, I was gradually closing it, controlling the flow of water from those underground springs with the same careful attention my father had used when he designed the system decades ago. My father had designed it as a perfect flood control system, and I was finally understanding the full genius of his plan and the incredible foresight he'd had about protecting this natural resource. The final time I dove down to that valve, my hands were trembling with emotion as I gave it the last few turns needed to shut it completely and restore the lake to its natural equilibrium. I turned the last bolt. It groaned once, then clicked a quiet final punctuation. Like the lake itself exhaled, like Dad said, "That'll hold." Immediately I could feel the change. Water stopped rushing in from the underground springs, and the lake began settling into its natural, sustainable equilibrium that my father had originally planned. I surfaced for the last time, breathing deeply in the evening air that smelled like pine trees and clean water, feeling a sense of completion and peace I'd never experienced before in my entire life. Swimming back to shore in the fading light, watching the sunset over the perfectly calm water, I realized I had always been able to control the flooding. It was a secret that only I possessed, the ultimate trump card my father had left me, like a gift from beyond the grave. When reporters came by to interview me about the miracle recovery, I just smiled mysteriously and said with complete honesty, "Maybe this lake has natural flood control mechanisms that we don't fully understand yet." A reporter asked if I believed in eco-spiritualism. I just pointed to the algae stains on my dive gloves and said, "I believe in torque." My story became something of a local legend, a tale about perseverance, wisdom, environmental justice, and the triumph of community values over corporate greed. The reporters started calling me the Lake Guardian, a title I accepted with humble pride, knowing it connected me to my father's legacy in ways they could never fully understand or appreciate. I think about Dad more these days, not just the valve, but the way he taught me to fix things slow without shortcuts. He believed every system had a soul if you built it right. Not just lakes, people too. Maybe that's why I didn't just flood the place, I tried to repair what they broke. Now, many months later, the lake has returned to its original beauty and is actually clearer and more vibrant than it had been in years. Fish populations have not only recovered, but are thriving. The bird migration patterns are back to normal, with some species returning that hadn't been seen in decades, and wildflowers bloom along the shoreline every spring, just like they did when I was a kid learning to fish from my father. I've returned to the peaceful life I always cherished, fishing in the early mornings when mist rises off the water like something from a dream, reading under the shade of the old oak tree my father planted when I was born, and enjoying the fresh air that smells like pine trees and clean water instead of concrete dust and diesel exhaust from heavy machinery. Harold Peterson turned out to be a real friend, not just a fair weather ally who switched sides when it was convenient. He stops by regularly now, and we've had some genuinely great conversations about environmental protection, responsible development, and how communities can work together to preserve what matters most. Mike Thompson found work with a reputable construction company that actually follows safety regulations and environmental guidelines, and he's helping them build sustainable projects that work with nature instead of against it. Funny how casseroles mean sorry. Nobody said the word. They didn't have to. They showed up, with food, with eyes that looked different this time. Every morning when I wake up, I pour my coffee and look out at that crystal clear blue lake, listening to the gentle lapping of waves against the shore, instead of the roar of heavy machinery and construction equipment. The coffee tastes the same, but the silence, it's different now, no tension behind it. Just birdsong and the rustle of pine. I sit beneath the same oak Dad planted and realize I don't have to watch for bulldozers anymore. I just listen for frogs. There's no more construction noise, no more cement smell hanging in the air like a toxic cloud, no more threats or legal documents appearing in my mailbox like clockwork. Sometimes when I'm sitting there in the peaceful early morning light, I think about Veronica and wonder if she ever figured out what really happened to her precious development. She probably never knew that her biggest victim was actually the one holding all the cards from the very beginning, the one with the power to protect what really mattered. The valve is still down there deep at the bottom of the lake, like a silent guardian waiting patiently if it's ever needed again. And me, I'll always be the only one who knows that secret, the only one who understands the full extent of my father's genius and environmental foresight. I won't keep it closed forever. It's a tool for protection, not a weapon for revenge, and tools should be used responsibly when the situation demands it. But if anyone ever comes around here again with plans to build something that threatens this lake, or tries to destroy what my father created, they'd better ask about flood risks first and do their environmental homework. The lake held. My father's design outlived them. And me, I never built anything that perfect, but I protected it. That was enough. Some people might call it a miracle, but I know better. Sometimes justice is just gravity, and all you have to do is loosen the valve. And now that the water's calm again, I've had time to think. Maybe the real lesson here is, when you fight for something bigger than yourself, you don't need to shout to win. You just need to know where the pressure is. If you're still here, I'd love to hear where you're watching from, or if you've ever dealt with a petty HOA yourself. And hey, if this one hit home and you'd like to support the channel, you can always tap the little thanks button below. Catch you in the next one.
Thanks for watching QA Stories. If you enjoyed this one, hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe for more wild tales coming your way.